We will continue with our chapter Man and the Battle of Life. Well, in our class yesterday, we were reading the description of the Kshatriya, and then we took up the concept of modern mind. The modern man, what he is supposed to be now, as against the ancient Indian civilization, which had stressed upon the individual nature, tendency and temperament, and based on that individual nature, this ancient Indian tradition divided the human society into 4 groups. And we have seen the advantage of such a division, where each one is really steeped in his own thing. That means what is very close to his nature and temperament, or what we call swabhava. And now we shall take up the next para, where Aurobindo is going to describe the advantages of the modern idea of man. We have seen the disadvantages. That is, if a single man is supposed to be a thinker and a worker and a producer and a fighter all in one, obviously things are going to go wrong, because there's too much of demand on him, and a single individual, he has to play too many roles. But in this para we see the advantages of that. The modern idea of a common obligation in all the main departments of human activity has its advantages. It helps to greater solidarity, unity and fullness in the life of the community, and a more all-round development of the complete human being, as opposed to the endless divisions and over-specialization and the narrowing and artificial shackling of the life of the individual, to which the Indian system eventually led. So, we see now the advantage of this, the new concept of man, the present, the contemporary. It helps in the fullness in the life of the community. So you see, the advantage straight away we see is an all-round development of the complete human being. So here, when the modern man is expected to be all this in one thing, the thinker and the worker and the producer and the fighter, he is becoming more and more an integral personality. That's what Sri Aurobindo wants at present when he says integral education or integral life or integral yoga. The main idea behind is that each individual human being should develop all the aspects of his being, be it the vital, be it the mental, be it the psychic, be it the physical. So in one individual, all the 4 aspects must be sufficiently developed. So the modern idea of this man who is all this, a thinker and a fighter and a producer and then a worker, it helps us to become a completer man. It does not say you are just a Brahmin and your business is not to develop aesthetics or do physical education. So that was the ancient ideal which had divided the society into categories. So what happened? A Brahmin developed only his mind. He neglected completely his physical. He hardly ever went into aesthetics and dance and singing and all that. So you can see the society may have been more at harmony But the individual was a partial development, a lopsided development. A Kshatriya always developed his physical, but he never developed his mind. So Sri Aurobindo is telling us this was a lopsided growth of the individual. And whereas we are moving towards an integral personality, and all that integral education tells us is this: to develop the child in an integral manner. That's what we have been doing to whatever capacity at the ashram school. The physical education, the aesthetics, and then we have the intellectual education, and then of course there is the spiritual and the psychic. So what's happening? Each individual is becoming a complete man. Well, it may be that each individual is not equally a complete man, but nevertheless, when we were kids, we were going to the physical education every day of the year. So physical education was part of the whole system. Then we would go to the classes every day, so an intellectual, mental development was part of the system. So some people were of course more bright intellectually or in the physical sports field. But on the whole, every child of the ashram is trained in all the four aspects of his being. Well, out of that, some people go off into the intellectual side more. Some become good administrators, some become good dancers and musicians, some become good sportsmen. But basically, the instrumentation is developed as to all the four aspects. So that, he says, is the all-round development of the complete man, being as opposed to the endless divisions and over-specialization and narrowing and artificial shackling of the life of the individual, to which the Indian system eventually led. You see, he calls it a kind of a narrowing and artificial shackling of the life. You see, these four healthy systems, called the Brahmin and the Kshatriya and the Vaishya, etc., ultimately they became shackles upon Indian society. Today, these systems, what Sri Aurobindo calls endless and over specialization and endless divisions. So in India, we have now so many divisions on the social level. They are not just these four of them. There is divisions and subdivisions and smaller divisions and endlessly. So that is what is really, binding the society, and is making it more divisive consciousness. So what's happening? There is no Unitarian consciousness in the society, in Indian society. We have divided our society and antagonized each other, saying that I am a BC, and that I am an OBC, I am this advanced society, whatever the class you belong to. So we have created antagonism in the society itself. So you see, in the beginning, if there are four divisions and four people were antagonistic, today there are hundreds of people, hundreds of divisions, and we are antagonistic against all that. So this has become, and then moreover, if a Brahmin wants to become a Kshatriya, he would be forbidden to do that, because they say, no, you are a son of a Brahmin, you should be always a Brahmin. So these, of course, in the real present times, I would say these are a little breaking down to whatever the policies the government is giving us. These mindsets are breaking down. A Shudra can become a doctor, and a Brahmin can become can get into the Kshatriya, get into the army. So there is an interfacing of all these divisions. It is happening for the good, because we would like to have an integral personality developed at the end of the day. So all this interfacing, intermixing is in fact a good sign. So Sri Aurobindo is telling us that, of course, when he was writing this, we didn't have this freedom that we see now in the present days, when there's an intermixing of castes and creeds, intermarriages are there, people are going, and Brahmin can become a Vaishya and a Vaishya can become a Brahmin. not by caste but by profession. So he says that this is evident enough in the character of modern war. From the idea of a common military obligation binding on every individual to defend and fight for the community by which he lives and profits, has arisen the system by which the whole manhood of the nation is hurled into the bloody trench to slay and be slain. Thinkers, artists, philosophers, priests, merchants, artisans, all torn from their natural functions, the whole life of the community disorganized, reason and conscience overridden. Even the minister of religion, who is salaried by the state or called by his function to preach the gospel of peace and love, forced to deny his creed and become a butcher of his fellow men. Of course, this is, somewhat what was reflected in his own time, especially during the two wars we have seen, that at that time there's no question of a kshatriya, that there's only a warriors who go to the war field. Everyone was pushed to the war field and to the trenches. And we have seen this in every country. So every thinker or artist or philosopher or priest or merchants or artisans, everyone was employed by the army. They said, no, we need a bigger army. We have seen this very much happening in Germany and in other countries also, where there was no distinction or discrimination between Brahmin and Kshatriya and Vaishya and Shudra. They said, no, we are going for a major war. Everyone must enroll. So this kind of a complete mixing up of all the castes and creeds was seen especially during the wars. And even now when there's a war, the clarion call goes up and says, we want more people into the army. So there are all kinds of people now getting into the army. Not only are conscience and nature violated by the arbitrary fear of the military state, but national defense carried to an insane extreme makes it best attempt to become a national suicide. That's a very important idea that comes through. National defense becomes a national suicide. You see, a lot of European countries, and also I've seen this happening in Singapore, that every young man, it was there in Bangkok also, that every young man, be he a Brahmin or a Kshatriya or an artist or a philosopher, whatever, they have to undergo the training of the military training. So what happened? So their conscience and nature was violated. That means, whatever was the temperament, it was not allowed. They said, no, you must get into the national defense. So this kind of a training, which even, I don't know if it happens in America, but I know some years before it used to happen. It was compulsory that we all go into the army. It was compulsory in the eastern countries even as now. So what happens here? That in the name, one of the arguments was that every young man should have a physical, fitness, so that if and when the need comes, he is ready to defend his nation. Well, it does seem ideal. But what's happening? You are killing this what he calls the character of the person, the thinker, the artist, the philosopher. He doesn't want to kill because he has a more refined taste, and whereas a Kshatriya, a warrior, he doesn't hesitate at all to kill because that is how he has been brought up, his family, and what you call the Kshatriya hood. But if you ask for a painter to come and join the army, so he may do that by force. But what are you doing? You are killing his conscience by force. So that's what Aurobindo calls a national suicide. That means this policy of enrolling everybody in the army against the person's wish Because in the name of saying that we want to really, train every young man, you are really making every young man this kind of a killing his inner conscience and deeper and finer sensibility. So this is a question that we have to see now. How far is this defense required? And in the name of the defense, to kill this inner conscience of the artist and the philosopher and the musician, etc. Indian civilization, on the contrary, made it its chief aim to minimize the incidents and disaster of war. For this purpose, it limited the military obligation to the small class who, by their birth, nature, and traditions, were marked out for this function and found in it their natural means of self-development through the flowering of the soul in the qualities of courage, disciplined force, strong helpfulness, and chivalrous nobility, for which the warrior's life pursued under the stress of a high ideal gives a field and opportunity. So again he comes back to the ancient Indian ideal. You see, Sri Aurobindo is now juxtaposing the modern ideal of man and the ancient ideal. So he's just not telling us what are the pros and cons. So there are pros and cons on both sides. As an individual, it is better to have this kind of a integral personality developed. It's good. But as a society, if you enroll into the army by force, remember, not by choice. By choice, yes, a Brahmin can go or a Shudra can go, that's not debarred. But if, and in the name of the national defense system, if you enroll everybody per force, then that is going to be harmful. And secondly, the modern system of war, I think I touched upon this point yesterday, it engulfs the whole country. When there is any war, as we said yesterday, nobody is left in peace. Somewhere or the other. I mean, imagine if there is one little war, a bomb that goes between Israel, there in Palestine, then we have the repercussions here in India, in Chennai, in Pondicherry. Repercussions on many levels, especially the economic level. The petrol prices hike up, the vegetable prices hike up, the transportation prices hike up. And all what? Because there's a war somewhere. And especially if it's there between India and other country, you know what happens. So what Sri Aurobindo is telling us, this kind of an overall damage to the country was avoided by the ancients. When they said, all the Kshatriyas, the army, you go to the front. The artist and the musician and the artisan, they were working peacefully. Because the army was given the food and the defense and whatever they wanted. But the other people, they continued almost with a normal life pattern. So this was the advantage in the ancient war and the disadvantage in the modern war. So he says, this was the tradition that they protected the country so that the country could progress. Otherwise, imagine these hundreds of wars, and for hundreds of years we have been having this, each kingdom fighting the other. If that were really involving the entire country or the kingdom, we could never have a cultural growth or a religious growth. But you have seen in India, in spite of the small kings and the kingdoms which are fighting each other, we have developed a fantastic art. We have developed art and culture and music and dance and literature, a plethora of activities. That couldn't have happened if each time there was a little war between two states, the whole state was disturbed. You see, even now, a little misunderstanding between Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, you see the row that happens, the people go on protest, they go on the strike, the streets are closed, there's a bandh call. You see, the whole city is paralyzed. So the whole system gets paralyzed for one little warring element between two states. So it need not be a war, but even one little quarrel between two states, there are a galore of bandhs and people don't know what to do. I mean, you may say that's a way of protesting, But that is how politics has come down into the level of the common man. And so nothing moves without these buns. And of course, Kerala and Bengal are known for their strikes, They are really striking strikes. Suddenly you hear 6 o'clock, auto strike, whole of Kerala gone. Bengal, they say, there are more strikes in Bengal than the normal day working. So what's happening? The whole life is, what we want to focus is, whole life is jeopardized. You don't know tomorrow if I'm going to office or not, or if I go, I'll return home or not. There could be everything that's happening. But this was protected in the ancient style. That's what Sri Aurobindo wants to emphasize, so that the cultural activity of the citizens could continue unabated. And the Kshatriya himself, the warrior, his duty was not just to kill and be killed. Because if every individual wants this mukti or salvation or growth, then we said even the Kshatriya himself can grow towards the Godhead by developing these great qualities of courage, discipline, and the chivalrous nobility. You see, a warrior is not just with a gun or an arrow in his hand. He also needs to develop qualities which are spiritual almost. Nobility, of courage, of self-discipline, and detachment. You see what the Gita speaks of the detachment, etc. The army man has to have this kind of a distance, if not detachment. When he sees the others as enemy, this kind of a detachment comes into human life itself. They are much more detached to life than we are. We are much more attached to saying, oh, that's going to be death, that's going to take away my life. We are more afraid and we are cringing. Whereas the army man, he says, no, death is a game, it just comes and goes. So you see, there are qualities which are spiritual that even the army man can develop and could develop on those times. Perhaps not so the modern times, but we are talking about the ancient Kshatriyahood. The rest of the community was in every way guarded from slaughter and outrage. Their life and occupations were as little interfered with as possible, and the combative and destructive tendencies of human nature were given a restricted field, confined in a sort of lists, so as to do the minimum amount of harm to the general life of the race, while at the same time, by being subjected to high ethical ideals and every possible rule of humanity and chivalry, the function of war was obliged to help in ennobling and elevating instead of brutalizing those who performed it. So you see, even war had its ethics. It was not just the planning of how to kill my enemy the fastest way, or perhaps the meanest way. Today we kill the enemy by the most meanest possible ways. But at that time it was a question of chivalry. It was your discipline. It was your own self-conquest. It was your capability. When you fought sword in hand and with another man and so with sword in hand, you showed that kind of a chivalrous, noble and strong capability. So he says this was the high ethics that guided the war. So you see, for example, even when the Gita, when the Kurukshetra war took place, there were rules in that war that you start the war with sunrise and stop with sunset. So nobody could trespass that. At the sunset there would be a bugle call and the whole army retreats. But now in modern wars, there's greater war at night time, whatever you call with the night vision or this or that. So we don't have any ethics now. Whereas there was some principle, ethical principle guiding them. And then also you are not allowed to kill another person who was under your degree, under your own level. That means if you are a swordsman or if you are an archer, you fight with a swordsperson or an archer. So if you are riding on the elephant, you cannot shoot down to another person. You have to have this you know, war between the elephants or between the horses or between the soldiers or between this. So there were really some rules of the game. So it's not a raw butchery. You got a man there, he doesn't have a sword, just go and kill him. No. On the contrary, if possible, give him a sword and say, come, let's fight. So that kind of a nobility of character. So Sri Aurobindo is emphasizing on that, is not just a brutalizing or a kind of a killing for the pleasure of killing. It was a character that was there. And in fact, we have heard stories, of course this needs to be verified, that after nightfall, the soldiers from each other's camps would go and meet. You know, if you had a relative on the other side, you could go and look after that. And then the doctors went across each other camps and then treated each other. So you see, there was still the question of humaneness. The doctors helped each other, the relatives visited each other, and then there was no war after the 6 o'clock, after the sundown. So it's only they were face to face as noble heroes and they fought their best. Once the hour was over, they were back to the humanness and the relations and all that. So he says it must be remembered that it is war of this kind and under these conditions that the Gita had in view. War considered as an inevitable part of life, but so restricted and regulated as to serve like other activities the ethical and spiritual development which was then regarded as the whole real object of life. War destructive within certain carefully fixed limits of the bodily life of individual men, but constructive of their inner life and of the ethical elevation of the race. So you see, war at the time was regulated as to serve like other activities the ethical and spiritual development. You see, in those times, the ideal of moksha, liberation, was prominent. So even the warrior, he saw that if I'm killed and when I'm killed, can I be liberated? Can I reach moksha? Yes, he also could reach moksha. But one who fought with dharma, with that kind of a principle, with that kind of a nobility, not just butchering the other person. So there were ideals were given that through war, the soldier, if he practices the war norms, could also develop ethics and lead this kind of a spiritual life and also reach the salvation. That is how I think the famous thing came up that those who die in the war field, they reach heaven directly. In fact, in one of his letters, Sri Aurobindo himself mentions about this, that those who died in the war field, they reached the heaven directly. So not only was there belief in Islam this is very strongly held, that those who do this jihad, their direct entry to paradise is guaranteed. So this is how the soldiers were not stopped from the gates of heaven. So even in India we had that, in Islam we had this. So warriors would joyfully go to war saying, after all, I'm going to reach moksha. So, and also there's a dharmic life, an ethical life guided them, and when killed, paradise is open for them. So he would say this is what was the objective and also the way people were guided. So Kshatriyas were not that lot who were saying, we damn care for you, you will never reach moksha, it's only the Brahmins who have the moksha and it's only the Vaishyas who can reach paradise. Kshatriyas can never reach. Otherwise people would never go to war. But you see, the whole thing was arranged in a very systematic, ethical way. That war in the past has, when subjected to an ideal, helped in this elevation, as in the development of knighthood and chivalry. So now we are getting examples from other cultures. The Indian ideal of the Kshatriya, the Japanese ideal of the samurai, can only be denied by the fanatics of pacifism. You see, this question of the knighthood or the samurai or the Kshatriya, they all had ideals to guide them. You must have read novels about this knighthood or seen movies about the samurais. They were extremely disciplined people, following high standards of ethics. Just because they were strong, they are not going to go and rape a woman. They were there, on the contrary, to protect women from all these things, to protect the society from all these ill things. So a soldier and a knight and a samurai was respected in the society as a man of self-discipline, somebody who maintained, who controlled himself. Normally nowadays, what do the gundas do? When we say gunda gadi, just because you have got a little bit of muscle power, you use it on the weak people. But there, imagine the Kshatriya had a lot of muscle power, but he never misused it. So that was a tremendous amount of self-discipline, a great honor. And you see, that was the character building, as we say, a character personality. So Aurobindo is giving us that the same ideals were there behind knighthood, behind samurais, and behind the Kshatriyas. Otherwise, when it has fulfilled its function, it may well disappear. Well, that's the prophetic line. What we said about the peace that may come, he said even the Kshatriyahood may disappear in the future. We may not need armies because we may not need war at all. We will not need war at all when we go beyond the mental consciousness in which war thrives and of which war is an instrument. But when civilization and mankind goes beyond, then we may not need war, so armies may disappear. For if it tries to survive its utility, it will appear as an unrelieved brutality of violence, stripped of its ideal and constructive aspects, and will be rejected by the progressive mind of humanity. But its past service to the race must be admitted in any reasonable view of our evolution. So, he says in the future, whatever the distant future may be, more and more this army may be utilized to serve the society, as we do normally in peace times. We engage the army in calamities, or when human societies, they require help, etc. But he says that may be in the future that we will not need them. But in the past, they were also a very noble race, highly respected, highly self-disciplined, and they were much needed by the society. I mean, they gave such a, it's not like the police of the present days. They are supposed to be the protectors, but on the contrary, they are more destroyers. They really create much more chaos and calamity in the society. But in those times, if there was a Kshatriya, a guard, or a soldier, we really had trust and faith in him that he would protect us. So this kind of a nobility is gone, the ideal is gone. Now the policeman or the persons who are supposed to really guard the society has become as corrupt as any other part of the society. The physical fact of war, however, is only a special and outward manifestation of a general principle in life, and the Kshatriya is only the outward manifestation and type of a general characteristic necessary to the completeness of human perfection. Well, here, of course, we have seen this idea before, that this Kshatriyahood is a special and outward manifestation of a general principle in life. You see, we had discussed this point, that when the society is growing or evolving, not growing, evolving, the society has to go through these 4 phases, we said: the physical, the vital, the mental, and of course ultimately the spiritual. So when the general principle of life is more or less the physical, vital, then we said the Kshatriyahood is a necessary thing. Because on the physical, vital stage of the human development, the protected is the Kshatriya. But now humanity is supposed to have come to the mental level. On the mental level, we see a lot of corruption coming in. The ethics have been destroyed. So the soldier and the policeman and all of them, for the soldiers are still supposed to be very disciplined. I mean, every country has a very disciplined army. But this nobility, this character, they're all lost. But at that stage, it says the Kshatriyahood was an outer manifestation and type of a general characteristic necessary to the completeness of human perfection. Now, you see, if we can understand it in a different manner, he says Kshatriyahood is necessary for the completeness of human perfection. What is that completeness of human perfection? Physical discipline. What now is in the recent decade or so coming back, discipline of the physical. Otherwise centuries were gone when nobody, at least in India and even in the world everywhere, people did not take care of the physical discipline. The body was there more as an instrument for your own pleasures, for your own happiness, for your own work. But the focus was never on the physical. Except to say, the army fellow, you go and have this discipline, but rest is not there. But now, the trend of the physical is coming back. That is why this completeness by the physical discipline is necessary. So today what Aurobindo is talking of about the integral personality, the physical discipline which was there with the Kshatriyas is coming back. So now even the common man is made aware that the physical discipline must be there, the exercise must be there, the strength must be there, the good food must be there, the balanced food must be there. So it's not the Kshatriyahood, but it's coming back as an ideal. Proper food, proper exercise, the spending of, you may name it in the name of calories or this or that, it doesn't matter. But the ideal of the physical discipline, or if I may put it in the Aurobindonian language, the ideal of developing the physical consciousness is coming back. And this ideal is of utmost importance if we have to see the development of the integral personality in the future. War typifies and embodies physically the aspect of battle and struggle which belongs to all life, both to our inner and our outer living, in a world whose method is a meeting and wrestling of forces, which progress by mutual destruction towards a continually changing adjustment, expressive of a progressive, harmonizing, and hopeful of a perfect harmony based upon some yet ungrasped potentiality of oneness. So now we are generalizing this theory of war and strife, that we have talked about war on the physical level, the vital level. But then Aurobindo, as he explained earlier in the previous chapter, on every level there is strife. You call it the outer or you call it the inner. Inwardly also we have already explained how there is a constant battle going within our own human being. We are not at peace with ourselves or within ourselves. Our mind says something, our hearts have some other thing, our body's demands are something else. So there is a constant battle. So this inner and the outer battle are there continuously. And maybe the truth is, because you have the inner battles, you have the outer battles. The day you achieve the inner peace, the inner unification, the inner calmness, it will be reflected outer level. On the outer level, you will have no war. So therefore, he is saying that this is happening everywhere and in the world whose method is a meeting and wrestling of forces. So constantly this world is a meeting of forces. Let's not think only on the external level, that one state is attacking another state or one country attacking another country. But even on the individual level, we are constantly being attacked by forces, not only from other individuals, but the occult level also. We know that there are these occult forces. So they are attacking us. I am responding to them with my reactions and sometimes I get into anger, I get into this. In response to the attack of the other forces, there's a there's a battle within me. So you see, it becomes more and more evident that constantly there is a war, there is battle, there is strife. But what Sri Aurobindo wants to tell us is that there is by all this a mutual destruction towards a continually changing adjustment, expressive of a progressive harmonizing and hopeful of a perfect harmony. So what is the outcome of this battle? Constant changing. Society changes, individual change, our pattern of life changes, our adjustment with the society changes. You see, this is a kind of a force which does not let you sit quietly. So all these battles and strifes and problems are coming so that we are continuously on the move. If we are not changing, then you are thrown out of the life rhythm, you are thrown out of the social rhythm, then you become static because you are not responding. So in a way, these are there as a positive element in society, so it moves forward, it moves forward. It may do mistakes, it may do blunders. It has done blunders, if we can imagine, in the great world wars. But the sum and substance of the great world wars is it has moved on. It's not just people have lived on, they have moved on a positive direction, what Sri Aurobindo calls here, to a kind of a progressive harmony and hopeful of a perfect harmony based upon some yet ungrasped potentiality of oneness. Okay, that absolute oneness of humankind is far away. But at least we are taking step 1, step 2, step 3. So in a way, we see this entire movement of this earth, of this humanity, is meaningful. We may see today all this terrorism and the violence and the struggle and all that. But this is on a different level, a kind of a, purification, a kind of a purging, a kind of a necessary thing. Because we are on the mental vital level, we are getting hard slaps, we are getting hard lessons. But that is how perhaps nature is taking us towards some ungrasped oneness. And moreover, it may be that because that oneness is already pre-existent within us and beyond us, that we are moving toward that ultimate oneness through a process of variation, through a process of struggle. Where there is variation, there is struggle, there is bound to be. Because we are not all of the same nature. So the strife is a means of progress. Because human consciousness, if it is let quiet, it rusts. So nature is creating all that to find out new methods of moving towards each other. The Kshatriya is the type and embodiment of the fighter in man who accepts this principle in life and faces it as a warrior striving towards mastery, not shrinking from the destruction of bodies and forms, but through it all aiming at the realization of some principle of right, justice, law, which shall be the basis of the harmony towards which the struggle tends. You see, it's apparently we understand what Sri Aurobindo is telling us. That there is this war, the soldier goes through all this killing, but he is not afraid of that. He is moving on. You see, when a soldier enrolls himself in the army, he has almost written his death bond. But he does it consciously. Yes, of course, nowadays, okay, you may be saved and most of the soldiers are safe. But in those times, where the warriors had to go to the field, the Kshatriyas were in the field, and so many of them would die. But they were not afraid of this kind of, destruction of bodies and forms. See the word forms. So there is somewhere a kind of a detachment in the soldier that after all we are going to come back again and again. So what if this form goes in this life? Does not matter. My soul is eternal. I shall take birth again. I shall come back again in a different form. So already there is a philosophic attitude. And more so, all this ultimately helps in the manifestation, or he uses a strong word, realization of some principle of right and justice and law. You see, in this manifestation of the divine, there are some basic divine qualities. One of them is law, justice, right. When we say Satyam Shivam Sundaram, these are these eternal qualities of the divine. So this principle of right, this principle of law, imagine the human society when there's no question of justice, no question of law or rhythm, then this divine principle, just as beauty has to be established on earth, truth has to be established upon earth, law also has to be established upon earth. That is what we call Satyam Shivam Sundaram. So Satyam is truth, Satyam is this truth, but also this beauty and also this goodness, goodness through law, through this justice. And Sri Aurobindo, in one of his writings in the Human Cycle, I think, maybe I'm wrong or right, I do not know. He says the Western society, especially from the time of Roman, you see Romans, all of you know the history, how they went around the world conquering country after country. But if you go deep into their Roman culture, they were extremely self-disciplined lot. But toward the end, they became indisciplined, and that was the end of the game. But when they were conquerors of the world, there was tremendous discipline and tremendous justice. And in fact, Sri Aurobindo would tell us that even Napoleon, when he went around conquering, he established that law, that justice, that self-discipline. And so there is, through these wars, one of the qualities of the divine is established upon earth, that justice and law. And this was the phase when these wars, especially the Roman people, and passed it on to the Western culture now, is so very established in law. That is why in the Western countries you see the systematic law. People are afraid of law because that law has gone into their own consciousness, into their own genes. It's not just law-abiding citizen. Law is part of their breath now. So what the Romans established, today we see the fruit of that. So if you see the traffic, nobody does unlawful things there. You may have accidents, that's different. But they do not break a law consciously. There are some, always exceptions, who are drunkards and who want to break the law. But on the whole, you see the Western society is law-based. Why? Because the Romans had consciously tried to establish this law, this justice, the principle of right. Later on, when the Romans got corrupted, this also got corrupted. But they caught the truth. And similarly, India, it caught the divine element of truth, an integral truth. So in India, we have emphasis upon truth. Truth in its manifold aspect. Truth is not in one religion or one caste or one creed. So we had this great truth that there is one and the many. That was the ultimate truth of the Vedas and the Vedanta. So India as a civilization did not go so much on the law and justice. It emphasized upon truth. So somewhere like that, maybe Japan. Those countries emphasized upon beauty. So you see, each country, each nation's soul catches one aspect of the divine and establishes that. And because ultimately when this earth wants to become or will become a divine habitation, it will be so because these principles are well established and rooted in the earth nature. So, but for rooting this one quality, you see there's so much of war, there's so much of struggle, there's so much of this thing that need to be done. So that's why when we see this question of what Aurobindo is telling us, that there is a principle of the divine which is manifested. So, after that, if we study the nation souls of each country, what has each country got to contribute to the general divine harmony or the general human orchestra? In this human orchestra, every country has a specific note. And that is what Aurobindo would call human unity. Now all these notes make a cacophony. But a time will come when it will be an orchestra, when human unity will become one human orchestra, wherein each one, West brings its law, India brings its truth, Japan brings its beauty, France brings in something, England will bring something. So that is what we call the human orchestration, and that is really the fundamental principle behind Aurobindo. The experiment of Aurobindo is precisely that, to make this possibility, as the mother calls it, is Aurobindo wants to be the bridge between the past and the future. So, taking the best of the past, it wants to give birth to the future. And once the future is born, then it will have its own great repercussions. So that is where we have to see that each country has a specific role. And in this we understand that this question of right and justice and law is a principle that is given to mankind through a lot of struggle. The Gita accepts this aspect of the world energy and the physical fact of war which embodies it, and it addresses itself to the man of action, the survivor and fighter, the Kshatriya. War, which is the extreme contradiction of the soul's high aspiration to peace within and harmlessness without. The striver and fighter whose necessary turmoil of struggle and action seems to be the very contradiction of the soul's high ideal of calm and mastery and self-possession. And it seeks for an issue from the contradiction, a point at which its terms meet, and a poise which shall be the first essential basis of harmony and transcendence. So that is the first argument we come to. The first half of the chapter was about this battle of life and about the question of the man in the Kshatriya time, the man in the present times. And then he concludes that saying that the Gita accepts this aspect of the world energy. Now she is completely going on a large scale, that Gita accepts that this law of justice, etc., has to be established upon earth. When Sri Krishna says, I am here to establish a new law, a higher dharma. But a higher dharma through what means? Through the means available, or the best means available at his time. And what was the best means available? Was war. Kurukshetra could not have been avoided. So it accepts it healthily, and then he would say, and the physical fact of war which embodies it, and it addresses itself to the man of action. Well, we started this chapter telling us this, because the Gita accepts the principle of war as the best means at that time of transition from the old to the new, then the best way is to give this secret of the Gita to a Kshatriya, not to a moralist, not to an artist, not to a philosopher. Because the Kshatriya represented this man of action, the striver and fighter, the Kshatriya. And it seeks for an issue from the contradiction, a point at which its terms meet, and a poise which shall be the first essential basis of harmony. Now, addressing itself to a Kshatriya, now the Gita tells us that how do we harmonize the spiritual action with the mundane action. How do we live in this world through this period of war and yet act in a spiritual consciousness? It only means that how a human being can live in this normal life, not only at the time of Kurukshetra but even now. Because Kurukshetra, as we said, is a symbol of our day-to-day strife. It is not that Kurukshetra happened then. Well, historically, yes, then. But symbolically, it is happening even now. Every day in everyone's life, there is a Kurukshetra going on. But we have to face it, we have to really find the clue and how to not to succumb and get depressed and then say, no, I will leave this world, like Arjuna was saying, I'll leave and go to the ascetic, become an ascetic. In fact, here, people are so despondent that they want to commit suicides. But this is not the way of living. So Gita tells us, we have here a principle that as the lotus leaf is untouched by the waters, you can be untouched by this strife and yet live a harmonious life with the society. So that has been the challenge of the Gita, to synthesize the mundane with the spiritual, the daily with the eternal. So that is why it is a grand synthesis. So it's not just a synthesis of Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga and Bhakti Yoga. Normally we say that's a synthesis. But we have to make it broader to say it is a synthesis of the human with the divine. So that is the first chapter, first part of the chapter, and we'll take a break now. We'll come to the second part, which has a different argument, but boiling down to the same point.